Nasty, nasty work, Tiffany Hayes. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. You are pushing for physical harm and violence on Caitlin Clark because she busted.
When Caitlin Clark set foot on a professional basketball court for the very first time, the entire world already had its eyes locked in. But absolutely nobody could have predicted the raw level of chaos, burning resentment, and explosive drama that would shadow her every single step. The hype surrounding her arrival was something the sport had simply never witnessed before, filling arenas to capacity, securing private charter flights, and generating million-dollar television deals practically overnight. But with that unprecedented level of fame came a very dark and dangerous shadow, one that painted a massive target directly on her back from the very women she was now lining up alongside as peers. For years, the veterans of this league had grinded away in near total obscurity, playing for modest salaries and clawing for every ounce of respect they could possibly earn. Now a rookie was strolling through the door and sweeping up all the credit, all the headlines, and every single endorsement on the table. It was a recipe for absolute disaster, and the tension festering inside locker rooms across the entire country was impossible to ignore. The media attempted to frame it as simple competitive spirit, a natural rite of passage for any elite rookie stepping into a tough and unforgiving league. But as the games kept rolling forward, the hard fouls began looking far less like basketball and far more like deeply personal vendettas. And just when people started believing the dust was finally beginning to settle, a fierce and violent collision with veteran guard Tiffany Hayes completely shattered every illusion of friendly competition, igniting a firestorm so intense and so consuming that it ultimately forced the league's top executive into an impossible corner. But to truly understand why the commissioner eventually exploded, you first have to examine the deeply buried resentment that had been quietly building long before Hayes and Clark ever crossed paths on the same court. The truth is, the narrative of veterans deliberately targeting Clark didn't begin with Tiffany Hayes. It was a slow and steadily boiling pot of frustration that had been bubbling with heat since draft night itself. Players scattered across the entire league were actively watching the media anoint Clark the chosen savior of women's basketball, completely dismissing the decades of blood, sweat, and tears that legends like Aya Wilson, Breanna Stewart, and Alyssa Thomas had poured into the hardwood floors beneath their feet. So when Clark finally suited up and stepped onto that professional stage, the veterans reached a silent, collective decision without ever saying a single word out loud. They were absolutely not going to roll out any red carpet. The physicality was immediate and utterly jarring. Fans watched in genuine horror as Clark was repeatedly shoved, hip-checked, and sent crashing to the floor with a level of aggression that seemed wildly disproportionate to anything resembling normal defensive basketball. The notorious shoulder check delivered by Chendi Carter became the first viral flashpoint that forced casual fans to confront the uncomfortable reality that this was no longer just a game. It was a statement. The veterans were broadcasting a crystal-clear message that no amount of college fame or public adoration was going to shield her once she crossed that professional line. The referees frequently looked the other way, treating the brutal contact as standard rookie initiation for a young player attempting to find her footing in the grown woman's game. But to the millions of brand-new fans who had tuned in specifically and solely to watch Clark perform, this wasn't initiation at all. It was a coordinated and calculated assault. Social media erupted with furious accusations that the league was sheltering a deeply toxic culture of jealousy, and every single hard foul was placed under a microscopic lens for the entire world to dissect and debate. But the situation was nowhere near finished escalating. It was about to explode from a simmering debate into a full-scale, all-out war. When the Indiana Fever lined up against the gritty and veteran-heavy rosters scattered throughout the league, the tension hanging in the air was thick enough to slice clean through with a knife, and Tiffany Hayes was absolutely not about to take a single step backward. Hayes, a hardened and battle-tested enforcer celebrated for her relentless energy and completely uncompromising defensive mentality, looked at Clark not as a transcendent superstar, but as simply another assignment to neutralize and shut down. From the very opening tip-off, Hayes made it her personal and deeply committed mission to turn Clark's professional life into a living nightmare every time she stepped onto that court. She stayed surgically glued to her hip, fighting ferociously through screens with a devastating physicality that repeatedly crossed the boundary of the acceptable. The cameras captured every exaggerated eye roll, every cold and calculated smirk, and every brutal exchange of trash talk between the hardened veteran and the celebrated rookie. On multiple occasions throughout the contest, Hayes leaned on her veteran instincts to deliver hard and punishing contact that left Clark visibly rattled and desperately searching toward the officials for help that almost never materialized. To Hayes and the entire old guard standing behind her, this was simply old school, smash-mouth basketball. The exact same brutal education they had been forced to absorb when they first entered the league with nothing but their talent and their grit. But to the enormous audience of fans watching from their living rooms, it appeared to be nothing short of blatant, unhinged, and premeditated bullying. The internet went completely and utterly nuclear. Clips of Hayes crowding Clark's space, bumping her aggressively after the whistle had already blown, and landing punishing fouls spread across every platform within minutes, accompanied by a relentless and furious flood of outraged commentary. Fans screamed for immediate suspensions, branding the behavior as disgusting and accusing the league's veterans of deliberately conspiring to injure the very player whose star power was filling the seats and paying everybody's salaries. And what happened next would drag the entire sport kicking and screaming into a massive and unavoidable reckoning. The fallout exploding from the Hayes incident was something the league's public relations department had never been remotely equipped to manage or contain before. The comment sections beneath every single official social media post transformed overnight into toxic digital wastelands, flooded with furious fans unleashing savage personal attacks against Hayes and every player who dared to step forward and defend her publicly. The narrative of the bullied, unprotected rookie became a runaway freight train with no brakes, completely dominating sports talk programs and breaking into mainstream national news coverage. Pundits who had never dedicated a single moment to covering women's basketball were suddenly devoting entire broadcast segments to the thug-like and criminal behavior being displayed by the league's veteran players. The atmosphere grew so dangerously hostile that players began receiving vile and threatening private messages, completely blurring the line separating passionate fandom from genuine and frightening harassment. It was a culture clash of absolutely epic and historic proportions. The traditional, gritty, hard-nosed culture of the league smashing head-on into a massive, fiercely protective fan base that expected and demanded their superstar be handled and respected like basketball royalty. The veterans felt utterly and completely abandoned by the media machine, cast as villains in a narrative where they firmly believed they were simply doing their jobs the way they had always been done. They pointed out with mounting frustration that when a male rookie like LeBron James or Michael Jordan absorbed brutal hard fouls in the early stages of their legendary careers, the world called it tough and character-building basketball. But when that same physical treatment was directed at Clark, it was suddenly being framed as an unforgivable crime against the sport. The divide was ripping women's basketball apart violently from the inside out, and the deafening and inexcusable silence pouring out of the league's front office was only pouring gasoline directly onto an already raging inferno. Every fan, every analyst, and every media outlet was holding their breath and waiting for the commissioner to step forward and restore some semblance of order. But the person sitting at the very top of this burning organization was already buried deep in a completely different and far more dangerous kind of crisis playing out entirely behind closed doors. WNBA Commissioner Cathy Engelbert found herself ensnared in an absolute nightmare scenario, desperately balancing on a tightrope stretched directly over a roaring and bottomless pit of fire. On one hand, she had the fiercely loyal veterans who had kept the entire league breathing and surviving through its darkest and most financially devastating years. She simply could not afford to alienate the very players who had poured their souls into building the foundation this sport was now standing on. But on the other hand, she was staring directly at unprecedented television ratings, staggering spikes in merchandise revenue, and billion-dollar media rights deals that were almost entirely and undeniably powered by the Caitlin Clark effect. The corporate sponsors were watching every single development with hawk-like precision, and they were absolutely not comfortable with the idea of their golden goose being publicly battered and humiliated on national television night after night. Initially, Engelbert attempted to play it completely safe, issuing politically calculated and carefully polished corporate statements about how rivalries were ultimately healthy for the sport and how the league was simply navigating a thrilling period of extraordinary growth. She even walked onto national television and had the audacity to compare the boiling toxic tension to the legendary and celebrated rivalry between Larry Bird and Magic Johnson, boldly suggesting that all of the drama was actually a powerfully positive development for the business of women's basketball. But that meticulously crafted public relations move backfired with absolutely spectacular and catastrophic force. The players' union erupted with fury, directly accusing Engelbert of exploiting their physical safety and psychological well-being as cheap marketing instruments to move tickets and generate buzz. At the exact same time, Clark's ferociously devoted fan base turned around and accused the commissioner of deliberately turning a blind eye to what they described as outright and documented physical assault simply to manufacture controversy and keep the cameras rolling. The pressure was compressing in from every conceivable direction, and the suffocating weight of media scrutiny was becoming completely unbearable for everyone involved. It was only a matter of time before the dam cracked wide open and everything came pouring out. After weeks of strategically dodging pointed questions and desperately attempting to pacify both warring sides simultaneously, Cathy Engelbert finally reached her absolute boiling point, and the reaction she unleashed left the entire sports world completely and utterly stunned. In a massive and thoroughly uncharacteristic departure from her signature polished and controlled public demeanor, the commissioner detonated at the prevailing narratives during a long-anticipated and heavily covered press address. She systematically and ruthlessly dismantled the notion that the league was secretly orchestrating or passively enabling any kind of organized bullying campaign against Caitlin Clark, branding those accusations not merely as absurd, but as deeply and personally insulting to the integrity of professional basketball as a whole. Engelbert stated with unmistakable firmness that this is a professional, ferociously competitive league populated by grown women who are battling every single day for their careers and their livelihoods, not a recreational summer camp designed to coddle and protect fragile egos. But she was far from finished. She aggressively pivoted her attention to confront the toxic and poisonous fallout that had erupted from the Tiffany Hayes incident, delivering a firm and unambiguous decree regarding the hateful and dangerous rhetoric that was gushing out from deeply disturbed corners of the fan base. The commissioner made it abundantly and unmistakably clear that while the league warmly embraced its wave of passionate new viewers, it would absolutely under no circumstances tolerate the racist, misogynistic, and explicitly threatening language being launched like weapons at its veteran players under the convenient cover of defending a beloved rookie. She essentially drew a hard and permanent line in the sand directly in front of the most extreme and volatile factions of the fan base, defending the fundamental right of competitors like Hayes to play aggressive and completely unapologetic basketball without living in fear of personal threats and harassment every time they walked off the court. It was a shocking and electrifying moment of raw, unfiltered honesty from a league executive who had always operated strictly within the safe and sanitized boundaries of corporate language and diplomatic messaging. She was planting her flag firmly in the ground, demanding unconditional respect for the veterans who built this league while simultaneously delivering a blunt and overdue message to the newest wave of fans that they desperately needed to learn and respect how the professional game had always been played. If anyone in the sports world believed the commissioner's explosive and unprecedented words would finally calm the raging storm and silence the endless parade of critics, they were about to be proven spectacularly and completely wrong. The instant Engelbert statement detonated across every corner of the internet, the veteran players experienced an enormous and overwhelming wave of collective vindication washing over them, and Tiffany Hayes was absolutely not the kind of woman to allow such a pivotal and defining moment to slip past without planting her own flag and making her voice ring out loud and clear. Never remotely inclined to bite her tongue or retreat from any confrontation regardless of its size or intensity, Hayes addressed the mounting bullying allegations with a scorching, fearless defiance that poured an entire barrel of gasoline directly back onto the already raging fire. She flatly and completely rejected any suggestion that she had done a single thing wrong on that basketball court, making it unmistakably clear that she was not about to reshape her game or sand down her razor-sharp edges for absolutely anyone, regardless of the size of their celebrity, the volume of their fan base, or the number of sneakers they pushed off shelves. Hayes exposed the staggering and undeniable hypocrisy burrowed at the rotting core of the entire situation, pointing out that when veterans brutally battle each other in the paint and walk away bloodied and bruised, the world cheers and calls it magnificent, suffocating defense. But the instant a high-profile rookie finds herself on the receiving end of that same treatment, it transforms overnight into a national scandal and a moral emergency. She stated with cold, unwavering certainty that if a player chooses to lace up and step onto a professional basketball court, they had better arrive mentally and physically prepared for total war, because nobody sharing that locker room was in the business of handing out free passes based on reputation or fame. Her raw and uncompromising words resonated with seismic force throughout the rest of the league, immediately igniting a powerful and sweeping wave of very public support from fellow stars who had been quietly and privately suffocating under the same crushing and relentless media scrutiny for months. They were exhausted from tiptoeing carefully on eggshells, exhausted from being relentlessly painted as bitter and jealous villains in someone else's fairy tale, and thoroughly exhausted from watching the media machine continuously disrespect and minimize the extraordinary legacy they had spent entire careers building. The veterans mounted a unified and defiant collective stand, essentially broadcasting to the entire watching world that they were the WNBA in its truest and most essential form, that they had constructed this league brick by brick with their own hands and sacrifices, and that they were not about to issue a single apology for passionately defending the territory they had bled to claim. The message was thunderously loud, absolutely crystal clear, and completely without compromise, perfectly setting the stage for what promised to be an almost unbearably tense and combustible remainder of the season. But buried beneath all the screaming headlines, the furious debates, and the parade of explosive public statements, there was one person whose reaction managed to catch absolutely everyone completely off guard and genuinely surprise even the most seasoned observers. While the entire basketball universe was collectively losing its mind and drowning in the manufactured drama swirling around her, Caitlin Clark remained shockingly, almost eerily composed, steering through the absolute hurricane of controversy with the measured and unshakable poise of a seasoned 10-year professional veteran. She never once retreated to social media to air her grievances or seek public sympathy. She never demanded that the league step in and construct a protective barrier around her, and she certainly never loaded up and fired back publicly at Tiffany Hayes or any of the other veteran players who had made it their visible mission to test her limits and push her to the breaking point. Instead, Clark chose the high road with a quiet and deliberate intentionality, repeatedly communicating to the media that basketball is and has always been an intensely physical game and that she had walked into this league fully expecting to absorb serious hits while learning and adapting to the professional level. She understood, perhaps more clearly and deeply than anyone else involved in the entire circus surrounding her, that the veterans were running a calculated test, pushing her to the absolute outermost edge of her mental and physical limits to determine once and for all whether she would splinter and crumble under the relentless pressure. By firmly and consistently refusing to wrap herself in the comfortable cloak of victimhood, Clark gradually and powerfully began to earn the grudging and hard-won respect of the very women who had lined up with the explicit intention of breaking her spirit and exposing her limits. She let her game deliver every message that needed to be sent, answering brutal hard fouls with deep, dagger three-pointers and jaw-dropping, visionary court awareness that left even her harshest critics momentarily speechless. The entire sprawling saga peeled back the surface and exposed a massive and undeniable growing pain festering at the heart of the sport. A difficult but absolutely necessary and unavoidable transition period as women's basketball steps with trembling but determined legs into the blinding and overwhelming glare of mainstream superstardom. The electric and volatile tension crackling between the old guard and the explosive new wave may be profoundly uncomfortable and deeply unsettling to witness in real time, but it has undeniably and permanently produced the most captivating, highest stakes, and deeply compelling television drama this sport has ever been bold enough to put on display. As the thick and suffocating dust begins to slowly settle over the explosive and far-reaching drama that erupted between the commissioner, the battle-hardened veterans, and the once-in-a-generation rookie sensation, one enormous and unavoidable question continues to hang heavily in the air for every viewer and observer left standing to ponder. If this extraordinary level of intense and deeply personal rivalry is genuinely what it takes to finally deliver women's basketball the global mainstream attention and recognition it has long deserved, is the toxicity actually tearing the game apart from its very foundation? Or is it precisely and exactly the kind of volatile fuel the sport desperately needed to not just survive, but truly and permanently thrive? When Caitlin Clark set foot on a professional basketball court for the very first time, the entire world already had its eyes locked and loaded. But absolutely nobody on the face of this earth could have predicted the raw and staggering level of chaos, burning resentment, and completely explosive drama that would relentlessly shadow her every single move from that moment forward. The hype machine surrounding her arrival was something the sport had genuinely and categorically never experienced before in its entire history, filling arenas to their absolute capacity, securing private charter flights, and generating million-dollar television deals that materialized practically and almost impossibly overnight. But riding directly alongside that unprecedented and world-altering wave of fame came a very dark and deeply menacing shadow, one that painted a massive and unmistakable target squarely and deliberately onto her back, placed there by the very women she was now lining up beside and calling her professional peers. For years stretching back through an entire era, the veterans of this league had grinded away in near total and suffocating obscurity, competing for modest and often insulting salaries while clawing and fighting desperately for every single ounce of respect they could manage to extract from a world that largely refused to pay attention. And now, without warning, a rookie was waltzing through the front door and effortlessly sweeping up all the credit, all the headlines, and every last endorsement deal sitting on the table. It was a recipe engineered for absolute and total disaster, and the tension rotting and festering inside locker rooms scattered across the entire country was completely impossible for anyone paying even the slightest attention to ignore or dismiss. The media made its best effort to repackage and sell the whole ugly situation as nothing more than simple competitive spirit, a perfectly natural rite of passage for any supremely talented rookie stepping bravely into a tough and unforgiving professional environment. But as the games continued to pile up and the calendar kept turning, the hard fouls rapidly began looking far less like basketball and dramatically more like deeply personal and carefully premeditated vendettas being carried out under the thin disguise of competitive play. And just when the casual observer started to genuinely believe that the worst of it was behind everyone and the dust was finally beginning to settle, a fierce and jarring physical collision with veteran guard Tiffany Hayes blew every illusion of friendly competition into 1,000 scattered pieces, igniting a firestorm so ferocious and all-consuming that it ultimately and inevitably forced the league's most powerful executive into a corner she could no longer strategically talk her way out of. But to genuinely understand and appreciate why the commissioner eventually detonated in the way that she did, you absolutely have to trace your steps all the way back and examine the deeply buried and carefully concealed resentment that had been quietly and dangerously brewing long before Hayes and Clark ever found themselves sharing the same court. The truth that nobody in the mainstream wanted to openly confront is that the narrative of veterans deliberately and systematically targeting Clark did not originate with Tiffany Hayes. It was a slow and relentlessly building pot of raw frustration that had been bubbling with dangerous heat since the very night Clark's name was called on draft night. Players positioned across every corner of the league were actively and attentively watching the media perform its elaborate coronation ceremony, anointing Clark as the messianic savior of women's basketball while completely and arrogantly erasing the decades of blood, sweat, and absolute sacrifice that generational talents like Aya Wilson, Breanna Stewart, and Alyssa Thomas had poured with everything they had into the hardwood floors beneath their feet. So when Clark finally suited up and made her long-anticipated professional debut, the veterans arrived at a silent, unspoken, and utterly collective decision that required no meeting, no vote, and no formal agreement. They were categorically and unapologetically not going to roll out any red carpet for anyone. The physicality that followed was immediate and thoroughly jarring to witness. Fans sat in stunned and genuine horror as Clark was repeatedly shoved with force, hip-checked with intent, and sent crashing hard to the floor with a sustained level of aggression that appeared wildly and inexcusably disproportionate to anything that could reasonably be described as standard defensive basketball. The notorious shoulder check delivered by Chendi Carter became the very first explosive viral flashpoint that forced millions of casual and first-time fans to confront the deeply uncomfortable reality that what they were watching had evolved far beyond a simple basketball game. It was a loud, deliberate, and unmistakable statement broadcast to the entire watching world. The veterans were sending a message written in the clearest possible language that no volume of college fame, no number of magazine covers, and no amount of public adoration was going to extend a single inch of protection once a player crossed that professional boundary line. The referees repeatedly and almost systematically looked the other way, conveniently categorizing the brutal and excessive contact as standard rookie initiation for a young player still learning to survive and navigate the demands of the grown woman's professional game. But to the many millions of enthusiastic and brand new fans who had specifically and deliberately tuned in for the sole purpose of watching Caitlin Clark perform her magic, this was never initiation by any honest or reasonable definition of the word. It was a coordinated and calculated assault being carried out in plain sight on a nationally televised stage. Social media ignited with furious and mounting accusations that the league was actively sheltering and enabling a deeply toxic and corrosive culture of jealousy and institutional resentment, and every single hard foul that landed was immediately placed under an unforgiving microscopic lens for the entire global audience to dissect, debate, and weaponize. But the situation was nowhere close to finished escalating and nowhere near its most dangerous and combustible point. It was coiling tightly and preparing to launch itself from a simmering and uncomfortable debate into a full-scale, no-holds-barred, and completely consuming outright war. When the Indiana Fever squared up against the gritty and thoroughly veteran-heavy rosters that populated the rest of the league, the tension hanging in the arena air was dense enough to slice cleanly through with a blade. And Tiffany Hayes was not the kind of competitor who was built to back down from any challenge regardless of how large or loud it arrived. Hayes, a seasoned and battle-forged enforcer celebrated throughout the league for her relentless motor and her completely uncompromising defensive identity, looked across the court at Clark and saw not a transcendent superstar deserving of special handling, but simply another assignment to be neutralized, suffocated, and shut down by any means the rulebook allowed. From the very opening tip-off of every matchup, Hayes made it her personal, deeply committed, and absolutely consuming mission to transform Clark's professional existence into a living nightmare every single time she dared to step onto that hardwood. She remained surgically and oppressively glued to her hip, fighting with savage physicality through every screen set in her path with a level of brutal contact that repeatedly and conspicuously crossed the boundary of what any reasonable observer could call appropriate or proportional. The cameras on the broadcast captured every single exaggerated eye roll delivered with cold contempt, every calculated and icy smirk flashed at a frustrated rookie, and every harsh and biting exchange of trash talk fired between the hardened veteran and the celebrated newcomer still finding her professional footing. On multiple occasions spread throughout the contest, Hayes reached deep into her extensive reservoir of veteran instincts and experience to deliver hard, punishing, and targeted contact that left Clark visibly shaken and repeatedly and desperately scanning the faces of the officials for any form of protection or acknowledgement that almost never arrived when she needed it most. To Hayes and the entire unified old guard standing firmly and proudly at her back, what was unfolding on that court was nothing more exotic or sinister than old-school, unapologetic, smash-mouth basketball. The exact same brutal and humbling education every single one of them had been forced to absorb and survive when they first walked into this league with nothing but talent, hunger, and sheer will. But to the absolutely enormous and fiercely devoted audience of fans watching and reacting from their living rooms across the country, what appeared on their screens looked like nothing short of blatant, unhinged, and deliberately premeditated bullying broadcast without shame on a national stage. The internet went completely and catastrophically nuclear in response. Clips capturing Hayes crowding Clark's every breath of space, bumping her with force well after the whistle had blown the play dead, and delivering one punishing foul after another spread like a wildfire across every major platform within minutes of the final buzzer, accompanied by a relentless and volcanic flood of outraged, furious, and deeply personal commentary from millions of infuriated fans who felt they had just witnessed something profoundly wrong being done to someone they had invested themselves in completely.